Hello, I'm Sarah Day, Policy and Research Manager at HFMA, and you're listening to HFMA Talk, the podcast for NHS Finance. My third conversation with Sanjay Agrawal took place just after he had finished 4 days working in intensive care at University Hospitals of Leicester NHS Trust. Sanjay is a consultant in respiratory medicine and describes his experience of working in ICU under such different circumstances to normal. Hello Sanjay, thanks for joining us once again.
Thank you, nice to be able to give you an update.
Brilliant, thank you. As we discussed last week, we have a few questions for you today from people who've listened to your previous podcasts. But first, could you update us on where you are as an organisation and what's been happening for you since we last spoke?
Yeah, so it's been a week since we last spoke, and so we're now, the date today I think is the 7th of April, as we've all, I think, discussed before. Every day seems like a year at the moment, but it is the 7th of April. And I thought that I would describe this past weekend, actually, because I was on the ITU Friday to Monday, today's Tuesday, and I thought that it would give people a flavour of what it's like, because the first two podcasts, I think the first week I was talking about training, the second week about my respiratory outpatient work, but I think this week it'd be good to take you through the ITU. So I started on Friday morning, and I have to say I did feel apprehensive in so much as this was the first time I'd looked after the intensive care unit where it was full of patients who had Covid-19. And I suppose the reason I was apprehensive was because there are now obviously a lot of people involved. So whereas normally we would start our morning ward round with, let's say, anywhere between 6 and 8 doctors, we now have about 16 people, double the number, for our morning handover. Now, for those of you who aren't quite sure what that is, so every morning on intensive care we have a handover at 8 o'clock in the morning, whereby the night team tell us about the patients from the night before, and then we pick up that information, and then we go on to do our morning ward round. The handover normally lasts about half an hour. And if you're coming on for the first time, as I was, I'd not been on for a few days, you sort of learn about the patients and their background and what to expect. So I would say the difference this time, obviously I've done intensive care for a long time, but the difference this time was that it was a whole new scenario. You know, I'd never looked after an intensive care unit full of COVID patients, and it is a new disease, and I'll get into that a little bit more. And I suppose the other thing is I was aware that I was the lead consultant for this weekend, and so I needed to have a good handle on everything patient-wise, but also because it was a big team, there were a lot of new faces. If I was apprehensive, a lot of other people were probably likely to be even more so, and I needed to, if you like, be reassuring and calm for them. In terms of our layout now, we've obviously expanded, and so whereas previously we had one big intensive care unit with 3 bays, we've now extended into theatre recovery, with elective surgery having been largely completely gone pretty much, and by Monday we also had opened into the paediatric intensive care unit. So there's now quite a much bigger footprint to look after. So anyway, back to Friday morning, we had our handover. At the end of handover, we now assign roles, which is not something we needed to do in the past, but the specific role is to have a team of 3 people who can go to the wards and bring up patients who need to be intubated and put on a ventilator. So we identified those roles and who was going to be doing that. And then we split up into smaller teams and go into the individual bays where patients are cohorted. Now, these bays have actually been completely walled off, so they're completely isolated, so that people have to get into PPE to go in, and then they have to obviously take that stuff off. It's called doffing before they can come out. So and these bays are completely, as I say, walled off. So we had 3 or 4 different areas where people had to doff and don and go into those bays. So we split up into smaller teams of 3 or 4 doctors to go into these areas. Now, doing our morning ward round, we go around each of the patients, assess what's been going on with them, whether they're getting better or worse, what things we can do to improve, hopefully their progress and to take them forward. And so that's what we do. With this particular condition, we're also doing something called proning, which is where we turn patients onto their tummies because they seem to ventilate their lungs better. And that way we don't have to ventilate them quite as hard or with quite as much oxygen, which then causes less long-term damage to the lungs. So a new thing that we're having to do on our ward rounds is to turn patients onto their tummies, or if they've already been on their tummies for 12, 16 hours, we then turn them back onto their back. This might sound simple, but it actually takes about 5 or 6 members of staff to do, and it's a procedure that can lead to risk where people become disconnected from the ventilator, or their tubes become dislodged, and so we have to be very careful with how that is all done. Just to mention, before we go into these areas, as I said, we all have to get into personal protective gear. And I would say that if you can imagine being in a hot country and having a complete set of clothes on, and then you put a second set of complete clothes on with a scarf, a hat and goggles, that's what it's like. And your skin can't breathe, and it is extremely hot, and it's very difficult to hear somebody who's talking to you, who's standing right next to you. So everybody in these bays with patients is like that. I liken it to essentially, being on the moon or some kind of barren area like that with an astronaut, a spacesuit, because that's what it feels like. And I have to say the real heroes in all of this are the intensive care nurses, because they're doing 12-hour shifts and they only have 2 half-hour breaks.
Wow.
And so they're absolutely cooking for that period of time. And I just don't know how they do it. As a doctor, I might be in there for 3 hours at a time, maybe for my morning ward round and then afternoon ward round, but they are there all day. And if we had the luxury of thousands of extra nurses, then maybe their shifts could be shorter. But we don't, of course, because some of the ITU staff are sick. And also because we've had to draft in nurses from other areas, they're actually, as well as looking after patients, they're training new staff who may have no experience of intensive care, who are really frightened themselves. And so these ITU nurses are having to kind of manage all of this, being absolutely baking hot, looking after really sick patients and teaching other people. So, hats off to all the ITU nurses around the country. So anyway, we do our ward round in the morning. We turn patients. We do any of the jobs that might need doing, such as putting in new vascular lines, writing a prescription charts, etc. And just to say, going into these bays, things can go in, but nothing can come out. So we can't bring pieces of paper out. Everything that comes out is binned. So remembering patient details, what drugs they're on, what their blood work is, a myriad of information, as much as possible. We have to try and remember it, or remember trends, so that when we do our post-ward round handover, we can tell the rest of the team about that patient. The next thing I'd say is, from a medical standpoint, is that this is a new disease. And so it is unlike other patients that I've looked after for the last, almost 30 years now, who have pneumonia. It's very different. The way we're managing him is different. And even though we've got information from China or Italy or Spain and other places, it's a bit like driving. Somebody can tell you how to drive, but until you actually get behind the wheel and use the pedals and turn and go on a motor, you don't know. And so I would say I'd heard a lot and learnt a lot before I did this weekend, but I did a lot of learning on the job this weekend about how patients respond to one thing or another. So it was very interesting, and I would say that for me, I found that unfortunately, patients only get better very, very slowly. So compared to our normal ITU population of patients that we had in our intensive care unit, our unit was mainly post cardiac surgical, but with some medical patients, you pretty much knew how people were going to get better, the speed at which they were going to get better. Whereas with this condition, it's pretty uniform. Everybody, if they get better, gets better very slowly. So you have to be very patient. You often take one step forward and 3 steps back. So there's a lot of patience that is required. And in some ways it can be disappointing, stroke frustrating about the speed at which change occurs. The other thing to say is that each of these bays, as I've said, is very hot. We had one recording of a temperature, the ambient temperature being 36 degrees in one of the bays, and they're all negative pressure. They were made negative pressure when the walls went up and we changed our ventilation. But at the time, I don't think anybody realised just how hot it was going to be, and there's not a separate thermostat. You can't open the windows. And so it's very hot. But the patients are very hot too. So with this condition, people have very high temperatures, and to cool them is quite difficult using things like cold towels and ice packs. There are machines, there's something called the Arctic Sun, for instance, that we use, but of course in the past we only ever had one of those because we would not need to use it very often. But now all of our patients are really, really hot, and we need to cool them because they deteriorate when they have temperatures that high. And so one of our key requirements this week is going to be to try and procure these machines that can cool people effectively, because cold packs and cold towels just don't do the job. So we do our ward round in the morning, and then we hand over. So all there are different people in different bays, and so we all come together late morning, and we exchange information about all the patients. So again, all the doctors and the nurse in charge come together. We talk about which patients need to come into the unit from the ward, because by now we'll have also had 2 or 3 referrals from the ward or from our other hospital in the trust, the Royal Infirmary. So for instance, on Sunday we took 2 patients directly from the emergency department from another hospital in Leicester, because they had no more room in their intensive care unit. So we had to facilitate the transfer of those 2 patients, which requires staff members to leave our intensive care unit to go and pick them up, which again is a problem. So we have our post-state ward round about 12 o'clock, and then we get on with additional jobs. So one of the things that we've had to get used to doing is, because patients' relatives are not allowed in the intensive care unit, or in fact in the hospital, we now phone each patient next of kin, usually in the afternoon, to give them an update. And of course it's awful for these relatives. Most of our patients are between 40 and say mid-60s, so they're all sort of that age, and they may have young families, and so we call their next of kin and give them an update. And of course many of these partners, wives, husbands haven't even seen their partner in the hospital. They know that they're on a life support machine, and they know things are pretty serious, and that the patient may not survive. So it's really hard for relatives to hear all this, and of course not be there to hold the hand or be with that person who's sick. you have to give, hope and reassurance, but it can't be false hope or false reassurance. So it has to be a measured conversation. And I feel incredibly sorry for all of the husbands and wives and mums and kids of these patients, because they just can't see them, and they're not going to be able to see them for probably weeks and weeks. So they're in a very difficult position. So that's patient relative. Now the patients themselves are all on ventilators and kept asleep, so they don't really know what's going on at all. We've had 1 or 2 patients who've improved to a point where they are no longer kept asleep, and they can see and hear and look around and see the activity. And I would imagine for them it's quite frightening too, because you have all of these doctors and nurses dressed up, and the only thing you can see is their eyes. So I would imagine there's a sense of being scared for the patients when they're woken up, which again isn't great, and it's very difficult to reassure them when you can hardly hear them and they can hardly hear you. So difficult for them, difficult for their relatives, I would say. So that's what we do in the afternoon, and then usually by mid-afternoon we then do our afternoon ward round, so we then get back into the PPE and go back in and see how the patients have done over the last 3-4 hours, and then make any further adjustments. Again, some people may need to be turned onto their front or onto their backs, and that, as I say, requires a lot of people to do. So the afternoon ward round is again another 2 to 3 hours, and then again we touch base, and usually by that time we've got other admissions that may need to come in from the ward. We are doing emergency non-COVID related work, so people, for instance, who need coronary artery bypass graft and can't go home without one because otherwise they would succumb to their heart disease. We're doing 1 or 2 cancer surgeries, aneurysm, aortic aneurysm, that sort of thing. So again, we have 1 or 2 of those patients in side rooms kept away from the COVID patients that also need to be looked after. So by about 8 o'clock, the night team come back on, and again we have another big handover. The night team is slightly smaller in size than the day team in terms of number of people, even though really this is a 24/7 disease, because we've always had fewer people at night and always had fewer people at weekends. That still is the case, although I have to say this weekend I kind of thought that we needed to alter this going forward, because some nights are really busy. So this weekend on Sunday, for instance, we had 5 admissions over the 24-hour period, and it was a real stretch based on patients being in all different parts of the intensive care unit in different areas like recovery, as well as having patients on the ward, as well as having patients coming from another hospital in the ED, and also some patients being referred for ECMO. So we were really stretched with senior consultants this weekend, and next weekend's a bank holiday weekend. And I think we absolutely need to make sure that we have more hands on deck, because I think for my trust in this part of the country, in the Midlands, I think our projected peak is going to be in this next week or 2. So I think that's something about the medical side of things. As I say, the nurses are the real heroes. The cross-skilling and staff from other areas have started to filter in this weekend, and I'm very grateful for them joining us. I have to say, our trust, I don't know how our trust compares to other trusts. It's felt a little bit slow at times in terms of getting staff from other areas that are no longer doing their elective work coming through to support. But I realise there must be big logistical issues around identifying those staff and training them, and then getting them to a point where they can be of help. And for those individuals, it must be quite scary doing something you've never done before. But I think this is going to be the way for the next few weeks. And so across the country, I would imagine everybody's grappling with this, and it is something, though, that has to be done, because the people, like our ITU nurses, for instance, it's not sustainable for them to carry on in the roles, even if they are overseeing the care of 4 patients rather than just 1 patient. They still need to be mentally and physically be able to do that, and to do that they're going to need support. So cross-skilling and redeploying staff to new roles is essential for us to take care of this epidemic. What else can I say? I'd say the mental side of things. What I mean by that is a concentration, because everybody's doing something in a different way. The mental effort it takes is much greater than if you're doing your normal job on a normal day in an automatic way. So I was quite taken by the end of my 4-day stretch about the mental tiredness as well as the physical tiredness I had. And that will be true of everybody, whether it's the ward clerk, whether it's the nurses or the porters or everybody, because it's just a entirely different world out there, which takes a mental adjustment, and also just putting on PPE and making sure you're doing it properly and taking it off properly so that you don't end up contaminating yourself or somebody else. Takes a fair bit of concentration. So my observations this weekend is that it is very taxing, and at times I found it harrowing. One more thing I must talk about is the ward. So when I went to see people who had been referred who were on wards, patients were often cohorted in bays that had doors. But it's pretty lonely in there, because staff only go in, understandably, when they have to do obs or when there's a need, but they're deliberately not going in unless they have to. And of course, visitors aren't allowed in. So these patients feel awful inside rooms, in bays, on their own, not really being able to communicate with anybody, no visitors, and feeling lousy because of their condition. And so it's a really tough time, I think, for patients on wards, for the unfortunate ones who are admitted. Yeah. And I don't know what we can do about that.
And where are most of your patients coming from? Are they ambulance conveyances, or are they GP referrals or walk-ins with symptoms? How do they get to you?
So how they get to the hospital in the first place will be through a variety of things. I suppose they're going to be GPs sending them to our hospital has something called a CDU, a clinical decision unit. The other hospital, one of the other hospitals in Leicester, has an ED. So I suppose GPs are sending them to one of those 2 places. The CDU, because we do a lot of respiratory medicine at my hospital, we are the respiratory centre. I suppose my hospital gets a lot of those direct referrals, and then I suppose NHS 111 will direct people to where they think it's appropriate. So that's where they're coming from. And
you mentioned across your 3 sites, you're the respiratory centre, but are all 3 of your hospitals taking people who have COVID-19 symptoms, or are you focusing in?
Yeah, so the Leicester Royal Infirmary is for sure. So that's the hospital with the ED. Leicester General Hospital, I don't know. I mean, they do predominantly elective surgical work. They have a surgical admission unit. So I honestly have lost. I don't know, because I don't actually have patients there. So I don't know if they're involved. But I know for sure Leicester Royal Infirmary and their intensive care unit, again, they've been ventilating in recovery, and I think even in anaesthetic rooms at times this weekend.
And you mentioned that you've expanded your capacity over the course of the weekend, almost moving to other parts of the hospital. So what was your starting capacity, and where are you now in terms of numbers?
So we are. We've outgrown our main intensive care unit. We're in theatre recovery, which has an additional 7 ventilated beds. Paediatric intensive care unit have transferred patients to other paediatric hospitals, so now we've got their 12 beds. And we started to admit into the paediatric intensive care unit yesterday. So we've got, I think between 20 and 30 patients at the moment. But the problem with, once patients get sick enough to need ventilating on an intensive care unit, that particular patient is most likely going to be there for 2 to 3 weeks, as opposed to a post-op cardiac surgical elective patient who's there for a day or two. So the problem for the nation and for us is that we will just accumulate with very little opportunity to discharge patients because it takes so long. So that's why our capacity is being outstripped by demand, because the length of time this illness takes to recover, if it recovers.
Yeah. So is there a typical pathway for an admitted patient with symptoms then, or does it just depend whereabouts you've caught them when they've come in?
I think the general kind of way things go is people tend to be symptomatic at home for, let's say, 7 to 10 days. Most people will get better, but then some don't. They then get referred into the hospital. By and large, we find that they're hypoxic, which means that, their oxygen levels are low. They then get put onto oxygen in the hospital, which is really the treatment for this condition. And then one of two things will happen. They get better on the ward after a few days, or their symptoms become worse, and then they come to us. And then we only take patients who we feel will benefit from intensive care. What I mean by that is people who have a lot of other medical problems, who would not be able to withstand a 3-week run on a ventilator. We wouldn't take them to begin with. So the pathway is they come in from home, they go to the ward. If they don't get better, and they're people that we think we can help, we'll bring them to the ITU. And then once they're in the ITU, they're probably going to be with us for at least 2 to 3 weeks.
And do you have patients in the hospital who are there for other reasons, who have then developed the symptoms of COVID-19, who have to move somehow? Yeah,
so there will have been. There will be patients like that, I'm sure, because I don't necessarily see those patients day to day, because all of my inpatient work is focused on the intensive care unit. I will only go and see ward patients who are being referred to ITU. The ones I saw this weekend were all patients who came to the hospital with COVID symptoms. Yeah. So they weren't the group that you've just described. They didn't come in with something else and then develop it.
Okay. I've mostly started asking you the questions that people have suggested. But one of the questions is about the difference between a CPAP machine and a ventilator, and whether there's a standard progression between them. If you're on one, do you then move on to another?
Yeah, so a CPAP machine is something that people in the community, in their homes, use sometimes if they've got something called sleep apnea. But in our particular context, we're using CPAP machines that on the wards, and we use it for people whose oxygen levels are very low that can't be increased just by giving oxygen. So it's a mechanical way of augmenting the effect of the oxygen. Now, the CPAP machines on the wards are not the same as ventilators. So the CPAP machines will only assist a person's spontaneous breathing, whereas the ventilators that we use in the intensive care unit take over the entire function of a patient's breathing. So in that way, they're different.
And you mentioned about oxygen levels, presumably blood oxygen levels. And one of the questions we've had is about the finger clip that people quite often have when they go into hospital, and how that measures your blood oxygen. How does that work?
Oh, so essentially that's the uses infrared. It fires it at the blood vessels at the tip of your finger. Sometimes we put it on an earlobe as well, and the way the infrared bounces back is proportionate to the amount of oxygen that the red blood cells are carrying. So it's physics basically, okay. But that's how it works.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, you've mentioned some people obviously do get better when they've been on a ventilator, but what happens when they come off of that ventilator? Presumably they have some sort of rehab for a period of time.
Yes, so one of the, horrible things about this condition is this is the experience around the country, is that you extubate, which means taking out the tube and taking somebody off the ventilator. And normally you only do that when you think somebody's ready for that. But what we found with this condition is people seem to relapse quite quickly, or at some point anyway, which might be 12, 24, 48 hours after taking the tube out. So with this particular condition, we're going to need to keep an eye on people in the intensive care unit for longer than we would have previously with other conditions, because they seem to have a sort of a relapse rather. But let's say that somebody does come off the ventilator, they're extubated and they stay stable. The next job will then for them to go to the ward, because we do not have the capacity to keep people on the ITU for longer than they need to be at the moment. And then from the ward, then presumably it will depend on community hospital capacity, or whether the patient is well enough to go home with, community in-reach into their home. I think they're the options, but we don't have the luxury of keeping people, I don't think, in hospital or certainly in the ITU for longer periods of time.
We've seen quite a lot in the news very recently about different medicines that people are beginning to try to treat coronavirus that have actually been developed for different conditions. Is there anything more you can tell us about that?
Yeah, so there are a lot of medicines that are being tested at the moment. So many of our patients are going into clinical trials, and these clinical trials aim to get sort of to answer questions about specific medicines that have shown some potential, perhaps in China or in other European countries. But at the moment, there's not enough evidence about any one medicine, be it hydroxychloroquine or tocilizumab that's used in rheumatoid arthritis, or steroids. So there's not enough information to say, that medicine is definitely helpful. But we're accumulating data through research all the time, but I don't know at what point we'll have enough evidence from research to say that medicine X is definitely the one to use.
Okay, thank you. I think I've just got one last question actually, which is about smokers. Actually, how does being a smoker impact on the ability to fight this virus? I'm assuming that it has some adverse effect.
Well, so the data from China suggested that people who are current smokers seem to fare badly if they got critical illness and were ventilated. But the data from China was actually conflicting, because there were a few studies, and there was another study that showed actually that there wasn't an increased incident in smokers. And also the Chinese population genetically is different. So even though you're a smoker, your genetics, based on what ethnicity you are, will also have a big impact. So I would say that if chronic smokers who've then developed underlying lung disease like COPD or other smoking-related lung diseases are going to probably not be able to withstand the acute lung injury from the infection with COVID. So they're less likely to do well than, say, somebody who has no lung disease. And we know that smoking causes chronic lung disease. So in terms of the big picture, I would say that smokers, if they've developed chronic lung disease, are going to fare worse. And that's just sort of, common sense, if you like, and very plausible. But if the question is, does COVID specifically attack current smokers because they're a current smoker, I don't think we have enough data on that yet.
No. Thank you. Thank you for answering all those questions. That's been really interesting. And thank you so much for telling us about your weekend. You must be exhausted. It's been really interesting once again. Thank you, Sanjay.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
To support our members and colleagues, all COVID-19 related briefings, blogs and news articles are openly available on our website, hfma.org.uk. There is no need to be a member to access these, so please tell your colleagues. We will do all that we can at the HFMA to support the NHS finance community during the pandemic. If you have any suggestions of other support that we can provide, please email us at policy@hfma.org.uk. Thank you for listening to HFMA Talk. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast to keep up to date with new episodes.